Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard to explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
Grateful to have with us Julie Tai and Angie Hong. Carrie and I have the privilege of getting to meet them more with all of our listeners. Angie Hong is a co-director with Julie. She's a critical, and we'll talk about their business in just a moment. She is a critical convener, engineer of human momentum. She's a mama of 2 boys, a cat, and a dog. She creates liturgies with thought and action. That's her jam. She's a musician, a performance art designer. In fact, I saw a recording of you singing, right? You sing, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Sometimes.
All right. She puts together meaningful gatherings around story and food, and that's what gets her up in the morning.
Well, that's Julie. That's Julie.
That's me.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay.
I just like to eat the food.
You eat the food.
I eat the food.
Got it. All right.
Yeah.
And so they're here to talk to us about the spirit of Kinship Commons, which was thoughtfully and lovingly founded by 4 women of color, Dr. Tamisha Tyler, Jennifer Guerra, Aldana, Angie Hong, and Julie Tai. And each of the co-founders brought in their expertise, creativity, and curiosities to imagine how a collective of artists could curate and design gatherings that offered glimpses of a new world. And so Angie and Julie took those imaginations and established this company as co-directors, while Tamisha and Jennifer continue in advisory roles. Now, I could share more, but I think we need to just kind of get into this and let you interpret what I just shared.
Yes.
First of all, how are you two doing?
I'm tired. I'm going to be honest.
Me too. And it's interesting. I'm in that place where I'm working really hard to get all of the things that I need to do done so that I can take a mental health day on Friday. So in order to take a mental health day, I have to stress myself out more. Monday yeah. through Thursday, just to try to give myself the space to breathe. So yes. I hear you when you say you're tired.
Yeah, that's how it goes. You have to prepare to rest,
Exactly. So, yeah. So, I am really curious to hear a little bit more about what your impetus for starting your organization was, I should say. And, what really drove you to say, hey, I think this is a really good idea. I see a need and we can fill it. And what was that need? So I would love to start there.
Yeah. I guess I could go since I kind of pulled the ladies together. I think I've done a lot of work in worship, and so has Angie, for longer than I'd like to say. And part of the reason why I kind of pulled this group together was after working in the world. For me, it's in mostly evangelical spaces. I saw that there was a lot of the same thing. Yeah, I'm going to just genuinely say that it was getting very boring, just truthfully. Because it was sort of like every single church was repeating what the church down the street is doing. So it was sort of a repetition of all the same. And I felt that there was a lot of lack in imagination around liturgy, around how people gather, around the kind of stories we tell. around the ways that we can be together. And so I brought together, I asked each of them individually, whom I have watched and witnessed in spaces, dreaming up new ways of being and thinking about new worlds or world building and all that. And I asked Angie to join because I was like, hey, do you want to do something like this? I have no idea what it is yet, but I'm just wondering, and we got into conversation. I've also been a admirer of her work and have learned a lot from her long before I even asked her this. So, when I pulled Angie in and I was like, hey, you want to do this thing? Do you want to do it? She was like, yeah, because we both have had so many long-standing relationships with different churches and spaces and such that we all love and care for. However, they were also kind of lacking imagination around this thing we call worship, and perhaps even stuck around who we were worshiping, and lacking of imagination about the who as well. And so there was sort of this space that I felt was like growing, a yearning that was growing. And so I pulled the four ladies together, and we just met up and we talked, and we kind of dreamt together this thing we call Kinship Commons now. And the thing about the artists are, all of us are artists ourselves, and all of us are in proximity to a lot of different artists that are doing different mediums of work. The thing about being around artists is we, I should say, are very, very comfortable in places that make others very uncomfortable, in places that are unresolved, the places where things are.
Can you break that down for us?
Yeah. I hate using this word, but I guess for any other term that's coming to mind right now, it's the liminal, the in-between spaces that a lot of imagination is possible. It's not quite here or there. And I think artists are really comfortable in places where binaries do not exist, where there's blurring of lines, where it could be the possibility of many things. And so I've always felt that artists had this like beautiful way of knowing God in things that are sometimes ungrounded, like are not really, this is it, and this is the only thing it can be. It's sort of, we're okay with like nebulous spaces. So we're also great with nuance. And so I thought, because the four of us are artists ourselves, we might have something to put together to gather people well, to give them a spark of imagination for what worship can look like and how God can be, and also how to build kinship between people and us and God. So that's how we came together, and we are a company. So, not an organization, but we are a company of small business.
So what are your services? What exactly are the services that you offer, and who do you offer them? Who's your audience? Who's your client?
Get over to Angie over here.
Yeah, I feel like when we talk to people, we don't call ourselves a worship company for a very good reason, because I think when you mention the word worship, because it's so limiting in the imagination, people immediately think, oh, music, it's going to be musical, and it's going to be it's going to be a musical buffet. There's going to be like salsa music, got black gospel music, CCM, and then hit that's what people kind of imagine. And the imagination kind of stops there. And so, we often talk about it's similar to kind of like the iPod, right? Like we're trying to create something that people just really don't know that they need or want, or know that they want, or need. And so a lot of the stuff that we do is we have kind of two sides. So the services that we offer is we create sort of these transformative gathering moments, whether they be virtual, which Julie has been doing these virtual gatherings. So she knows all these best practices on how to do that, to where it's very interactive and you're not just watching a screen for an hour. So we create those sorts of moments virtually and in person, where we create very interactive, using all the senses and gathering people together to have these transformative moments with the divine. And then our goal really is to have it be coming from people who have found themselves on the margins. So what would it look like to give artists in our collective, Kinship in the Commons, what would it look like to just say, like, you have full permission to bring it? Like, you're not going to be captured. You're not going to be boxed in. You're not going to be questioned of, does this mention the body and the blood of Christ every single time? Like, like, what would it look like to just give these artists who consider themselves believers and in places of faith where they can't really express themselves fully, to give them the permission to create along those lines, and then put all that together in a very curated liturgy way to where it can be experienced and people can find themselves or find a soft landing place for their spirituality to breathe and to give themselves permission to explore what worship can be.
I'm really fascinated and so curious because as in one of my lives, I'm a church consultant and I work with churches, predominantly white churches who are attempting to become anti-racist, right? Who are trying to deconstruct their own whiteness, right? And so I'm really curious to know if you have done a lot of work with predominantly white churches. And if so, I'm not even going to ask if, I'm going to ask what kind of resistance have you encountered? Because I'm sure you probably experienced some resistance in predominantly white churches, maybe. And maybe it was a different type of thing, but I'm curious. I'm curious to know what your experiences with that has been.
The interesting thing is, churches have not hired us.
Interesting.
Yeah, but we work in proximity, in the sense of denominations have hired us, like the full denomination.
Right. Gotcha.
So not individual churches in that way, or organizations that work with many, many different kinds of denominations and non-denominational spaces, all pulled together in one room. That's the kind of space that we're leading. It could be different, like one that we're working with very soon is a group of women, Baptist women that are coming together to hold a vigil because the SBC is cracking down on women being pastors. And so they're holding a vigil and they hire us to design that experience. Yeah. And so we're kind of in those types of spaces. I wouldn't say that we've ever been in a space that has been predominantly white, although there have been white people present. And if there are spaces that are maybe a more 50-50 or leaning, there is a strong number of white folks in the room. Thankfully, we haven't had strong resistance because we are careful to design things that welcome lots of people.
Yeah.
We're thoughtful about hospitality. We're thoughtful about all those things without watering down anything. We're keeping like very tight to the things that we believe in. And if you look on our website, you'll see that we're very committed we are open and affirming. We are very committed to kind of this large bandwidth of possibilities and diversity. And we do not ever waver on those things. We are not going to compromise those things, but we are very good at being hospitable to people who might be on a spectrum of belief.
I was really asking that question because you had already kind of, there were two things that made me think about it, just given the spaces that I move in and my understanding of the white psyche is when you talked about how artists exist in this liminal space and we love to make other people, not love to make other people uncomfortable, but it tends to be the thing that we do. Right. And then also you talked about the idea of of creating a space for marginalized people to take up space and to not make themselves smaller, which I mean, totally affirm that. I love that. And also I know that that's going to be one of those things that's going to make the white psyche really uncomfortable in a lot of cases, not every case, but in a lot of cases. And so I was just curious to know if that was something that you had experienced. And if so, how do you address it? If you address it at all, or if you just let that be and let that work itself out. But it sounds like maybe that hasn't really been a factor. I don't know.
Well, so it's sort of the reason that we exist because that has been our experience. back when, so before anti-racism, right, was racial reconciliation. And so to go back to those days in the early 2000s, late 90s, churches were trying to be more diverse and multicultural. And that was a really, really big movement. And Julie and I both were, and many of our friends who are artists, musicians of color, we were hired to create that effect because for some reason, people think that worship is the best place to start to foster diversity. And so they're bringing up all, Acts 2 and Revelations 17, 18, 19, 21, 22. And they're saying like all tribes and tongues, like everybody's welcome here. And so we were all hired to kind of fill it out and be the look, and for me, where it became old fast was not just a tokenization and just using us, but it's just the turnover rate, because it is very, very exhausting.
It's like working in DEI.
Well, that's a whole other podcast, David. But then we would be replaced with like caricatures, so there'd be like the Black person who does like all the embellishments and singing and does all the white stuff with a gospel bent. And then you've got like the Latino, like you have these caricatures of people that they could just hire to come in. But what was that really accomplishing except for some sort of cosmopolitan, like, oh, this is like New York City. This is a Gap ad. This is a Benetton ad. It was that deep. And there was some sort of like celebration around our culture, but not around our racial realities. And so in this anti-racism like era that we're in, my question with that is, I know what Black worship is, and I know what white worship is. And I think I know what Latino worship is because you just sing everything in Spanish. What is Asian American worship? And that is the question that opens up the problematic nature of the anti-racist, like in worship and anti-racist sort of movement, because our notion of race is so flat. And you can't do that with Asian. Like there is no common experience. So to ask that question is actually a very dishonest question. And it comes with a lot of problems, both theologically and in the body politic about how that manifests itself. And in the past, I used to try to come up with an answer. I used to try to flatten or come up with a sound that was very authentically ours. And I'm no longer going to do that because that is surrendering to an idea of coloniality within the church that is so rampant. And I am not going to bend to that. Yeah. Does everybody have that level of analysis? No. Like your average musician is like, they just want to sing their songs of Jesus. Like, honestly, and that's great. That's so amazing. But then what happens is they feel all these things in their body. They feel this sort of rage and no space to let it out, which leads to the turnover rate, which leads to them feeling a certain way.
Wow.
Kinship Commons is actually centering those people. Right. So we do have to decenter the primarily white trying to do the things because of the ways in which we function in those spaces, all of those spaces over many years.
I'm currently in a doctorate program. I'm getting my doctorate of ministry, and I'm in a class. I'm TAing a class called an anti-racist gospel, and we were having a conversation just recently. Actually, it's an anti-racist gospel ? Which the question mark is important. And what's really interesting is we were having a conversation, and I don't remember how it started, but we started having this conversation around the fact that the difference, and this is, please excuse the binary because it's so limiting, but the difference between, the white diverse church, the predominantly, or I should say the diverse church that's actually really practicing a dominant white culture, right? Yeah. Even though it's diverse, compared to the Black church, and how much easier it is for Black people to visit and become a part of a white cultured church that's diverse than it would be for a white person to go to a Black church. Like that doesn't happen as often, right? It may happen occasionally. And so we started talking about how interesting, how that reflects the flow of the presumed flow of assimilation. The way assimilation is supposed to flow is always into whiteness. That's the assumption that whiteness would never assimilate into another culture. The expectation is that other cultures are to assimilate into whiteness, right? And so the idea of decentering is that's essentially what you're doing. That's what you're subverting, that very that flow of assimilation, and saying, hey, everybody gets to be in this space. Yeah, I love that idea of what you're doing.
This makes me think of, over the years I've had the privilege, the joy of traveling to many countries. And this is one thing that I've noticed, that if you go to a church, for instance, I remember this is like 30 years ago almost. My wife and I visited Ghana, and we went to this big church, 10,000 people, and they had amazing musicians, and they were performing music that was produced in not only the white world, but in kind of like, like Ron Canoli I don't know if you remember him from back in the day. He did what I can't remember, but he's African American, but he was the music minister at a large white church in San Jose. So it influenced that church's music. So it was Blackish, if you will. So this Ghanaian church did this music that was really foreign to them to some extent. And they did it better than, the recordings that I was familiar with. However, when they switched to their own music, to their own language, it had a whole different atmosphere. I mean, it became, and even though they could get into the earlier music, and they danced and so on, when they switched to their own cultural music, and I noticed this in Brazil, that they could sing. They're largely bilingual, and so they could sing in English. But when they sang, in Portuguese or in indigenous languages, they got closer to their roots, and it affected the very atmosphere, the emotionality, everything that was going on. And can you connect that, Julie and Angie, to what you're doing in any way?
I guess the connection would be that we are focused on capturing those moments or those stories and narratives that are they're disappearing or invisible or sidelined or marginalized, and placing them center stage. And we can't help it because we're all people of color doing this. So, I can't tell anybody else's story but mine. And Angie and I, okay, so this is how much variation there is. Angie and I are both second generation Korean Americans with immigrant parents, except she grew up in the South and I grew up in LA. We do not have the same experience, even in the least bit. We do not agree on what it means to be Korean American in this generation right now. We do not have, there's so much variation, even amongst people who are supposed to have a united narrative, right? We're supposed to have the same narrative, except her experiences in the South are ones that are so foreign to me. In my experience in a very, very big, diverse LA with a lot of Asian Americans and a Koreatown, a robust Koreatown, is very different. And we want to capture those nuances. Those are the things that are not being done because we're so focused on and concerned about a racial category that when we actually disaggregate it and we see what kinds of things are happening that are different, even amongst two Korean American women, second generation living here in the United States, even between us, we don't have the same experience. When we capture those things, I think that we pronounce a God that is very much different than the generic white, het, male, colonial God that we've been given.
So what inspired you or incited you to, instead of just becoming exasperated and giving up on the whole project? What inspired you to create something, new, an alternative kind of thing? What's behind that?
Yeah. So aside from, doing the worship universes of things that we've done in our past, we, without sometimes even wanting to, end up in a lot of conversations like this, like race conversations, except the people in the room are usually all white. And we're like the token person talking about what does it mean to be not white, et cetera. And what is like theology that's emerging from the margins. And so we have to kind of always be these representatives of like all things that are race. And for me personally, I'll only speak for myself. I got really exhausted by being in spaces that only knew how to reject things, but couldn't build something new. So what do you do after you reject? Like I can reject this white colonial male God all day long. And I can hate that God and I can walk away from that God easily, but I don't know where I'm walking to. I don't know if there is something else out there because I spent too much time being anti everything and built nothing that was beautiful or good. Or I don't even have to build it. There's already so much there. There's already so much in existence. By centering it, it really means that we're just giving it kind of like some attention that it didn't get before.
That's so beautiful.
And that was my personal journey to it. I got sick and tired of like deconstruction, and all that stuff. Those are all good things. These are all part of processes that are necessary for human like development and growth and maturity. But I think we spend a lot of time rejecting things, but we never build anything new or beautiful.
You're making me think about two things. One is Ruby Sales. I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but Ruby Sales talks about being pro-racial justice rather than anti-racist. Standing for something rather than against something. So that your words made me think of her, and she's got one of the most agile, amazing minds I've ever experienced. So there was that. And then also, again, to your point about you can only talk about your own experience, as can I, right? As a white-bodied woman. And so one of my experiences was I started to realize that white people suffer from a huge failure of imagination in imagining what a world would look like without white pseudo supremacy. And so that's why we are not taking a more active engagement in its deconstruction, right? Even for those of us who say we don't want this thing, but we don't know how to create something new, right? And so we don't know what would be on the other side. And that other side is terrifying, right? What does it look like when we are not privileged and empowered the way we are? We automatically assume that it's going to be something horrible rather than the beloved community, or rather than the realm of God, which John Franke describes as a world where everyone has enough and no one needs to be afraid, right? Which is my favorite description of the realm of God. And so I love that idea about this idea of let's start focusing on creating the new thing, and how that has to come from the community. It's a communal event. It's not something individual. And so centering marginalized voices so we can see the beauty that's being created, I think is really paramount for me personally. And I'm not saying this has to be the conversation, but I'm just saying for me personally, my work is trying to figure out how white-bodied people move into that part and participate that in a responsible way. So I'm just really curious about that. But so tell us a little bit about what stuff you do besides music, because you mentioned that it's not just music. So what are some of the other things?
Oh yeah, this is so Julie, because she can go into some of the other, like, I mean, I think to go back to a little bit of what David was saying too is this like changing of the atmosphere when it's like your music. I think this is like so interesting, and I think this may tie into some of the practices that Kinship Commons has really been exploring in like reintegrating some of these things. So this sort of, what is worship, these like standards, right? So singing something that was made by something that was, capitalized and globalized all over the world, which is why you hear it all over the world, because they corner the market. There's 12 people that write and dominate most of these songs in the Christian, like contemporary music arena. And they have a way of marketing. They know what they're doing. And there's ways in which I'm so glad that they've mixed it with some of their own music that comes out of their own communities. I would say that's not the case in a lot of places. And I think it goes to show like how strong whiteness is associated with Christianity. You know, like the standard of Christianity is like the white standard, right? Which is what Jennings talks about a lot. And so I think to like disentangle those, Kinship Commons, we want to provide the space for people to really kind of suss that out and to give themselves sort of like the permission to do that. And it's not like this demonic thing. So Julie and I and Kinship Commons, we led a retreat in January. And we sort of took this ritual of Chesha, Korean ritual of Chesha, which is an honoring of our ancestors that was done a lot before coloniality and before mass conversion to Christianity. But it's an honoring of your ancestors where you prepare food, you create an altar with like picture, or you visit the gravesite, the tombstone, the mound in which they are buried, and you lay out the food, you offer it, and then later on you do a whole ritual around it, and then later on you eat the food. And so I know I simplified that so many ways. So sorry, Julie. Sorry, all Korean people. But we incorporated that into this retreat. That practice of preparing food, sitting with it, doing a ritual around it, and then eating the food. And it was sort of, I feel like in many ways we are experimenting ourselves, but to create a space for that experimentation, that disentanglement, but also like a reintegration of those practices. Because a lot of Christian practices are pagan, like do stem from paganism. And so like we need to just continue that lineage, right? And just not do it in the way that Europeans have dominated those practices.
Wow.
Nice sigh, David. I love that sigh. Deep sigh.
Thank you for that, Angie. You know, when many of us think of art, we think of resistance. You know, we can even attach it to Guernica, Pablo Picasso, or some of the controversial exhibits at the Museum of Modern Art or whatever. But it seems to me that the soul of the artist, when liberated, is asking questions. It is seeking to be bilingual, if you will, or multilingual. It's trying to communicate in ways that go beyond what it has been given. And so I'm wondering, what I'm thinking about right now
I love that.
Is how many people experienced what they interpreted as a spiritual, even church-like feeling during after George Floyd was killed. People were marching in the streets, and I heard from people, and I had experienced this long before George Floyd. But it's like people said, "I found my church." In this, but there was no singing to Jesus or anything like that. But there were anthems in some cases, but they weren't those anthems. But the humanity of it all seemed to be the gospel, if you will. Can you speak to that at all?
So I actually lectured on this topic in this like theomusicology class that our friend was the professor of. But I did talk about in the formation of Black Lives Matter and Trayvon Martin and the sort of like protests that were going on in the streets and as you mentioned, most recently, George Floyd. The protest liturgies that were coming off the streets, right, are very do resemble revelations, which can be read as a protest, a documented protest against empire. And so, and I think the church was really stunned with the formation of Black Lives Matter because it was not led by Christians. There was no messianic Black figure, male figure. but it was started as a collective and sort of facilitated by 3 Black queer women. And I think the church was honestly shocked that they were not at the center of it. And they tried to do whatever they could to block it. And it was a movement that could not be stopped. And for me, that era really highlighted for me how detached the church had become from those roots of Acts and in Revelation, how detached all of that had become because they were sort of practicing this sort of transcendental, transcendent sort of like it's all about me and Jesus and nothing else matters. The world fades away. And yeah, they definitely faded away. they faded all the way because they did not know how to respond anymore.
Wow.
And
there
that
are
was taken up.
churches now that still will spend 6 months arguing whether or not they should even put a sign that says Black Lives Matter in front of their church.
Right.
I mean, they can't agree on that because of the way the phrase has been politicized,
Yeah. And the divisive nature of it, which is hilarious to me because, I mean, Jesus was divisive. The church has always been divisive, so that would just fall into our lineage.
Exactly. We're right on track if we're being, if we're stirring trouble, and then we're right on track. And, it's interesting too, because I always talk about how there's this thing called, I don't know if it's in some creed anywhere, but there is this doctrine of unity that much of the institutional church loves to cling to, and it essentially silences any kind of voice of justice, right? Because you're being divisive, you can't be divisive. The thing that you're protesting, the thing that you're pointing to, the harm that's being done is far less important than the divisiveness that you're causing right now by making me uncomfortable by talking about it, right?
That's right.
And it's this I've experienced it as being somebody who was on church staffs in a large, a few, but one in particular, large mega church, non-denominational mega church just outside New York City. That, we definitely,
Let's compare notes.
We should. Not publicly though, not yet anyway, but we should, I was literally told I had to stop writing my blog because I was writing I was writing in affirming language for LGBTQ communities. And I was told we don't write about divisive issues, right? Mm-hmm. So staff don't get to write. And I'm like, it's, caring for people shouldn't be divisive. I'm not sure how this is not translating. So it's really interesting how that doctrine of unity is used as a tool to suppress voices of justice.
So Julie, Angie said that you could speak to some of the other ways that you do art, if you will. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. We are creating different kinds of practices and liturgies that both invite practices of our traditions or like our cultures that have been lost because, for example, she just named Cheza. It went away in my family when we became more Christian because God didn't like it. And so those are things that we're restoring. There are other things that we are building anew. One of our favorite things that we do is build cosmic chapels where there isn't much of an agenda, except it's a room that's, we use projectors to basically cover the room, floor, sky, ceiling, wall, every corner with the cosmic, just images of the cosmos. And we have these like anti-gravity chairs where people lie down and dream. We do things that are maybe don't belong on a Sunday service or whatever you want to call it, but our space is for encouraging imagination, encouraging healing. We're really big about helping people take just their first step towards some wholeness and healing. So we work with, we do a lot of our work with like psychology and such, and try to adapt practices that help people emotionally regulate. Part of the reason for that is we're not going to avoid difficult topics. We're going to go into them, except we're going to give you a lot of tools to emotionally regulate while we have these hard conversations, which could include doing some somatic exercises. It includes a lot of breathing. Often when we're like worked up, we stop breathing. We don't know it, but we're holding our breath. and we're tensing up everywhere. And that usually turns into rage and anger. And rage is also holy. So we're not trying to avoid that either. We just want it to come out in a way that's constructive, that's helpful, that's healing, not harming somebody else in the room. So we do a lot of integration of somatic practices, and we invent some ourselves that help people really engage with what's going on and be able to stay. And then also there's, we're never offended when someone needs to leave because they're being really, really worked in that moment and need a breath. Go for it. Please leave the room. We want you to. But we're not going to avoid difficult conversations and topics as a way of sort of doing unity. You can talk about nothing and still be divisive. So the thing is like, the way to unity is not going to be avoiding the topic. The way to unity is like actually engage it and wonder together and ponder together and actually work through the difficult stuff. We just want to do it in a way that's hospitable, that's loving, and also emotionally regulating. Adults don't know how to do it. Kids do it naturally. We don't know how to do it. We lose those abilities as we get older. So some of the things that we create is really to help people spark imagination, take a second to just escape to the cosmos for a moment, breathe there, find God there, just float around in space there, have some fun there. Fun is also important. And be able to have more capacity for the challenging world that we live in, actually. I would also say that a lot of the things that we do in building liturgies and building gatherings, I feel like at some point, my background is I have a very eclectic background. I grew up mostly Roman Catholic and then moved into Protestant spaces after college. So my upbringing is all mixed. And sometimes liturgy like stops to reflect common life. And so it divorces itself, makes it a different thing, which I think sometimes we need some of that escape. However, we do a lot of things that reflect common life. Our liturgies are a reflection of our most mundane moments. But when you ritualize it, it becomes special.
Sacred.
Sacred. It does. Technically, as common as eating together is like some of the most beautiful things we do as people of God. We eat together. It is the holiest thing, perhaps, that we do, is to dine together. It's my favorite thing that we do. I think it's the best thing we do. I love it. I love to eat and I love to cook and I love to be people.
Gifting. That is
I love it so much.
I mean,
but it's because it's so ordinary. It's not remarkable at all.
Yeah.
There's nothing remarkable about it. It's something we do every day.
Do you find that there's a special touch of enthusiasm and joy when it's potluck?
We have a friend. Dr. Joyce Del Rosario, who has invented this whole theology around potluck. Y'all need a
potluck theology.
Potluck theology.
She's really developed. Mm-hmm.
There's a whole thing. We won't do it. We won't do it here because y'all need to just invite her next, because she could have a whole thing on that. And it's stunning. It's a beautiful theology. She's Filipina. And so that potluck thing is for real. Filipinas throw down when it's potluck. It's not like everyone brings Oreos and a bag of chips. Like, no. They bring their best of the best of the best dish that they make. And then that potluck is like, you'll probably not need to eat again for like probably 48 hours after that. But it's you need to get her for that.
So it
I won't go into
the abundance of the realm of God.
That's right.
Right?
That's right.
Yeah,
Yes.
that's beautiful.
Yeah,
that's beautiful.
And so we basically look at communities of color and we say, what is like ordinary about what we do that nobody else thinks is ordinary? It could be as simple as like for Asians, it's like removing our shoes when we walk into the home. That is absolutely ordinary. However, if I ritualize that, it somehow starts to hold power and it starts to heal in ways that we didn't expect before because
Holy
we took something
ground, burning.
Exactly. Exactly.
So I really can talk a little bit more, because you just blew my mind a little bit about how when we ritualize something, we give it power.
Yeah.
That makes total sense to me. But now that you have brought that into my awareness, I'm like, yes, that makes perfect sense. But, but speak more to that, because that's powerful.
Yeah, I think liturgy always feels divorced from people when it no longer reflects our common life. we're out here trying to build something that does. We're taking ordinary things like Chesa is a annual practice that we've been doing for centuries. It's not remarkable in that way that it's this thing that I knew it while it was happening all the time. But I somehow, when I became like more on the Protestant Christian, especially, I blocked it out in my subconscious. Like, it's kind of like this thing that I knew about, I've done with my family for many, many years. We just stopped one day. So when I was going into learning those practices again, it's like I almost knew how to behave in it. It was already in my body to do it. And all Angie and I are doing, and what Kinship Commons is doing, we're just placing it center stage and going, this is a beautiful moment that we get to share in this practice that's centuries old. And we modernize it for today. We bring attention to it. We ritualize it. We give it words. We give it song. We give it action. We invite people who don't know anything about this and invite them into this too. So we are hospitable for people who have not practiced Chesa. And at the same time, because it's so common to Korean people, the people that recognize it, they know it as healing because it's being practiced in a place that it shouldn't be practiced.
You made me think of, we're doing something, our community. In fact, today, my wife's the cook, but I do the grunt work. And so we're going out we live not far from the University of California, Santa Barbara. And, there are pro-life protests. And by pro-life, I mean anti-genocide.
Yeah.
An encampment there. And so we've been coordinating with our friends, taking food. And, the atmosphere for things like that is enhanced by not only bringing everyday food that is basically the blend of multiple cultures, but also taking food that is consistent with the folks, their ancestries, like taking hummus and stuff like that. And there's this solidarity that is enhanced by the food, and this sense of awe, if you will. And I think that there sometimes, going back to what you were saying, Julie, sometimes worship or Christian experience is a quest for awe, to experience. But instead of questing for awe, we could quest for the ordinary, and when we do that, that becomes a side effect, if you will. Does that make sense?
Yeah. What I really love about all that is being shared is that I feel like a lot of the work of like the rituals and all of that is about reconnection and reconstituting things that were separate, so putting our bodies together with our minds and our souls, right? Like reconnection by breathing in these somatic experiencing, reconnecting actually the sense of time instead of it being so linear of past, present, future. The cosmic chapel suggests that we are a constant constellation with dead stars that help us to imagine into the future, that help us be in the present. We are like reconnecting these things that have been disconnected for the purposes of, XYZ, all the isms. And by having ritual and sacred sort of around it, we do sort of, upset that ability to disconnect. Like we refuse, right? It is a refusal of the disconnection and very much about the reconnection. And I think as I was listening to Julie talking, I was like, oh, this is like reconnection of time, reconnection of the body. Like it's all these things that are like reconstituting the things that were destituted.
Yeah. I love that. I love that so much. And I hope that you don't mind, because again, I'm in my space where I'm working on my doctorate and my thesis coming. And so quite some time ago I think my second semester of my MDiv, I actually got to sit at Ruby Sale's feet, literally sat at her feet. She held my hands in her lap and she stared me in the eyeballs and she said, whiteness is flattening and homogenizing. Whiteness is murdering the souls of white people. It is flattening and homogenizing you, and it is stealing the legacies of your lineages. And I have never been able to get that out of my head. And have since I've been studying, I'm of Irish descent. And so I have been studying Druidry, like just trying to understand. And I have gotten, as I study the history of it, I have gotten so angry at what has been stolen from us because of Christian colonialism, right? Like the wisdoms that have been separated, that I have been separated from.
Yeah.
And I have this image of a dandelion to represent white women, right? Much hated by everyone, prolifically ubiquitous in manicured lawns everywhere, right? Like cheery, bright and sunny, but deeply rooted and connected through a deep taproot, and
Just
incredibly
for
nutritious.
housewives. Oh, never mind.
Yes, yeah, exactly. but deeply nutritious. Every part of the plant can be used, right? And I'm trying to figure this out. This is essentially what my dissertation is at, like this working through of this. How can I find the nurturing aspects of this embodiment, right? And as I'm thinking about this, I have the queen of dandelions. I'm going to send a picture to you all because I've never seen a dandelion plant this big. It is literally bigger than the biggest pumpkin you've ever seen. It's huge, growing in my garden right now.
Wow.
It's huge. And so because I'm thinking deeply about community, and I'm hearing you speak about these mundane things, right? This, how do we ritualize the mundane? How do we reinstill the power in our most ordinary lives, right? And I'm just blown away by the beauty of that imagery. And I'm curious to know if you have daily practices that you participate in on a regular basis that help you to ritualize the mundane in your lives on a regular basis.
Yeah. Mine is extremely simple and short. I do the practice of paying attention. I walk the same path with my dog every single day. And it could be boring, but it's not, because I choose to pay attention to the bud that was a bud yesterday and is now a flower.
I love that.
To neighbors that I haven't noticed before, to sounds and smells and the changing climate. I'm constantly in the practice of, I just need to notice and I need to pay attention. There's nothing, I'm not praying or anything like that. There isn't some kind of thing that I do. There isn't a ritualized, like this. The ritual is, as soon as I walk out these doors, I'm paying attention and staying alert to noticing the smallest things, the biggest things.
Yeah.
I've gotten really good at pointing out every hummingbird every time it's somewhere nearby.
Yeah.
I've gotten so good because I just train my brain to notice it. And so every time I'm looking, I notice in the corner of my eye, I'm like, hummingbird. And my husband thinks I'm like some kind of wizard at it at this point, because I can name I could point at 12 of them on our walk, and he hasn't seen any of them. So he's like, where? And I'm like, right there. It's just a practice of paying attention and noticing and being very aware of what is absolutely ordinary.
Yeah, I love that.
How about
That's
you,
so
Angie?
beautiful.
Well, I am a chauffeur at this point. I drive around my two kids all day, every day after.
Familiar with that experience,
jobs.
yes.
Yeah. And, I, in many ways, hate doing that, because I just feel like in many ways, it's just a waste of time and energy, because I'm just sitting in a parking lot.
Yeah.
Or just in a car somewhere. I'm just constantly just driving things. But, lately my youngest has been really getting into hip hop.
Yeah.
And I am a hip hop fan. So he's going through history. Like right now he's into Nas, and Tupac and stuff. And so, and so I
That's
was like,
amazing.
so he'll
How old
explore.
Is he?
He's 10.
All right.
So he'll pull up I know it goes so, and early Kanye. Early Kanye. But
yes,
but so we'll go through and I'm like, let's talk about the beef between, let's talk about, this is like a diss track. And I'm sitting there trying to like tell him like where it fits in like the history. And he's like, okay, sure. But can we just like listen to the music? And so we'll just sit there in silence, and I'm just driving, this everyday thing. And we're just like cranking up these songs. And I'm like, I love this. I love it. Like every time every lesson that we go to, and he's getting really big into martial arts. So we're like 2-3 times a week, at least, just driving to those things. And we're just like listening. And I've just like found so much joy.
Well, cool. Carrie and I want to celebrate Kinship Commons with you.
Yes.
I just get the impression that you're like, to use, sports reference, you're like in the weight room right now, but the big game is ahead of you. So just keep doing what you're doing, right?
Thank you.
Thank you.
How can people find you? How can people find your work?
kinshipcommons.com, or you can follow us on Instagram at Kinship Commons. Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Reach out to us.
Well, it was such a lovely time talking with you. I know that your time is short, so we are at time, but thank you so much.
Thank you
for being here today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
I hope we can have you back when your muscles are even bigger.
Anytime. Anytime.
All right.
Thank you.
Bye, guys.
Bye.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at GodIsNotAnAsshole or text 805-703-8393, because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole. The show's music is composed by Christian Moore, show art created by Evan Kerr, and the episodes are produced by Josh Perez.